Welcome everyone on this fine day with the Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and the shrink, Dr. Margarita Guri, and they call me Dr. Red Shoe. Today's topic has to do with conflict and apologies, and we'll be working on that. Let me introduce some key players. So Dave Bricker is our meeting monster. He's one of our dear friends. He introduced the good Rabbi and I for an ethics panel that he put together. And he is going to be monitoring. We're going to do things in the following way. The key player of the day is the chat. If you look in the bottom of your screen, you have these icons and you click chat. If you have a question, a comment, a concern, a complaint, not too many complaints, please, put it in the chat. And then I'll monitor it, and so will the Rabbi, but Dave will if we're talking and miss something. That way, if there's something timely, Dave could say, hey, the most important player, Adam, has this question, and then we'll interrupt and do it that way. If you also want, there's a little blue hand. If you go to the participant icon and go by your name, you can raise your hand. But I think we're such a small group, you can always raise your hand this way. All right, so let's get it started. The whole idea of conflict. I know none of you have conflict in your lives. Is that true? Okay, now there's the ethics of being polite. Rabbi, if we're being polite and not saying something, is that unethical?
That's actually a question that's been on my mind a lot these days. You know, if you go back to when I was in college, something was very popular at the time called assertiveness training, and something that was in the same field was a seminar called EST. Some of you might remember. And the people who went through these trainings didn't always come out with the best reputations, because one of the things that they should teach you in assertiveness training is that the rest of the world isn't always assertive, and that you have to accommodate other people. It's not so simple that I'm doing the right thing, everybody get out of my way. I'm living in a world with other people, and other people aren't always doing the right thing. They're not always comfortable expressing themselves. They're not always comfortable receiving criticism. And so we have to calibrate our moral sensitivity barometer. So, you know, and another way we say it is to choose your battles. I don't have to assert myself on every single point. Sometimes it's okay to just let things go. For instance, I just heard someone make a grammatical error. I didn't feel the need to call it out because it's not that big a deal. And sometimes recognizing that it's best to just let something go and not create conflict over little things will save up our conflict for the issues that really should be addressed.
And I think one of the things that you and I have done a lot of talking about is ethics is in everyday moments. And what we choose to think, say, and do is the foundation of ethics. So Rabbi, we also have a word of the day. Why don't you start us off with that?
Okay, the word of the day comes to us from Susan Rooks, the grammar goddess. And the word is Zeitgeber. Zeitgeber is an environmental cue that helps an organism regulate its biological clock. So for instance, when it starts getting dark, our bodies start beginning to shut down and going into nighttime mode. So I'd like to suggest that we need a Zeitgeber, we need an ethical Zeitgeber, an ethical clock. That we're sensitive to the cues that we pick up from those around us, from the culture that we live in, the society that we're involved in. Yeah, so we can regulate our ethical clock by being sensitive to the circumstances around us.
So are we being unethical if we let everything slide? So you talked before about the ethical I guess, the choices we make about when we say something, when we don't. So I see a lot of people creating conflict by not doing that. So if we never speak up, how ethical are we being?
Well, this is why I like to say there's no app for being ethical.
Well, you got to work on that, Rabbi. I mean, really, by now I think the Catholics have one. We're very black and white. You got to catch up.
Well, I'm going to leave that to the younger generation. But the truth is that the problem with trying to quantify every ethical dilemma, I mean, that's what compliance laws are all about. And that's why I say that sometimes compliance is the enemy of ethics, because being ethical means that we are grappling with those kinds of decisions and choices all the time. Constructive disagreement is essential to an ethical society. We have to be willing to express our opinions, to express our points of view, to generate a certain amount of back and forth, because that's how we can see issues from every possible angle. How do you decide which issues are worth raising and which should be overlooked? That's exactly the kind of sensitivity that we're trying to develop in ourselves. And there's no formula for that. It comes from experience, it comes from sincerity, it comes from sensitivity. And it's going to change from one situation to another. In one context, it might be important to call something out. In another context, it might be better to let it pass.
So as you're listening, please put questions, comments, concerns in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to those. Because I think that this is an issue that's full of emotion. Anyone who's been following Facebook, LinkedIn, the newspapers, Twitter, knows that these days people don't always know how to disagree with kindness and respect. Our civility is in trouble, I think. So part of why I decided to start this, I invited the good Rabbi. I can't call him Yonason. I know that I'm Catholic and I'm not going to go to hell for it, but I just can't call him anything but Rabbi, even though we're friends now. So the whole issue is kind of complicated, isn't it? So what questions? What makes us behave or act or react unethically? Ooh, that's a great question, and that's from Aya. How do you say your name? Aya. Aya. All right. So you want to handle that one, Rabbi? And then I'll address this too. What makes us behave, act, or react unethically?
Yeah, it's an interesting, very fundamental question. I was on a podcast and explaining my view of ethics in business, and the host came in with, what you're saying is just so obvious. Why doesn't everybody do it? And the answer is both simple and complicated, because we are complicated people. Human beings, by definition, are creatures who are in conflict with ourselves. We are contradictory. We have the amygdala, which is driving us to seize every opportunity for pleasure and for gratification. And we have the frontal lobe, which is looking ahead to what's ultimately going to serve our best interests. And those two parts of the brain are in conflict with each other. And we're living in a society that is increasingly impatient, pleasure-oriented, gratification-oriented. And so the whole culture is working against us, trying to teach us, grab what you want, take what you want, get it now. Well, ethics requires circumspection, reflection, discipline, and sometimes we have to respond quickly. If there's a crisis, if you're in the moment, sometimes you have to seize the opportunity. You have to jump right in. And it's training ourselves, it's developing that self-discipline. And part of it is what we're doing right now, is having these kinds of discussions so that when the time comes that we have to make those choices, we'll be better prepared because we've already reflected on these kinds of questions and issues.
I think that the issue of being ethical and what makes us behave and misbehave. That's my favorite thing. Well, who hasn't done anything that's a misbehavior, and isn't it fun? And what is misbehavior? If I'm with Alibaba and the 40 thieves, is it misbehavior to steal? No. In that situation, it's misbehavior to not steal or to be generous and give back. So I think depending on the culture we're in, and many of us are in various cultures, we're raised in one religion, we go to another, we're raised by people who are too rigid, and then we go the other way. All sorts of cultural issues in the corporate world, educational world, the community. So misbehavior is defined not only by the context we're in, but I think it has to be defined by how it feels for us. Does it feel like the right thing to do? And unfortunately, some people aren't comfortable asking that question. And some people aren't so good at knowing what is actually the right thing to do or not. And that's okay. The question is to keep asking. Some people do not have a good moral compass. And I always suggest to them they find someone who does and talk to them or ask what would they do, right? So like Popeye had a pretty good moral compass, except for with violence, right? So when I was a kid, I would think, what would Popeye do? I got beat up a lot as a kid because I was Cuban, coming into this culture, coming into Miami, not speaking the English language. And I would want to beat them up. And my mother would say that was Jesus. Again, we're Roman Catholic, and the rabbi, you may notice, is not. And she would say, that's Jesus. Show him who you are. And I thought, well, and my standard line was, Jesus has a great right hook. And all of us have a great right hook. So then the question is, someone else's misbehavior does not dictate my misbehavior. The minute someone misbehaves and then we put more fuel on the fire, we've given up all our power to them. Sometimes parents are disappointing, bosses, mentors, they misbehave. The whole point is, what is this next step for us? And we don't have to take immediate steps unless it's a crisis. The question is, what are we going to do about it and how we're going to think? Richard, put your question in the box and we'll address it. Yes, so we have the question, are moral compasses contextual? The answer is yes and no, just like any ethical response, right?
Yeah, there's an expression they use called situational ethics.
Yes.
And it's a troublesome term because it suggests that ethics and morals are variable, are malleable. And the way I like to look at it is that moral principles and ethical principles are absolute, but situations change. And so applying, again, you talked about Alibaba. There's actually a concept in Judaism. The term in Hebrew is a tinuk shenishba. It's a child who is kidnapped and raised in a society of thieves. You can't expect that child to grow up with a functioning moral compass. And so allowances have to be made for somebody who grows up in a culture that is lacking sound ethical direction. It doesn't mean that the behavior is ethical. It means that there is an accommodation made for somebody who's lacking the capacity for ethical sensitivity.
And the question is, can we teach people those moral principles if they somehow did not catch them along the way earlier in life? And I'm going to give you the typical psychology answer, depends. I've worked with people with no moral compass. I've worked with teenagers who've murdered. So I was a psychologist in private practice for over 40 years. So I've met a variety of individuals struggling with a variety of circumstances. And one thing I do believe is most people want to do the right thing. Who believes that? Thumbs up or thumb down? Do you think most people want to do the right thing? Yeah. Gerald, you don't know? Yes or no? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
I think most people want to do it.
Okay, so thumbs up. Okay. Lee Bricker is a little bit of both ways. I think most people want to. The question is, what gets in the way? So let's talk about Freud and the id. Freud said pleasure principle. We're born, I want. And we all know what we want, and it feels good. And then the other question is, but what are the consequences of getting that right now in this way? And what's the impact on other people? So if we ask the question of what is the ethical thing to do, our feelings of feeling good isn't always the question. We have to develop a moral compass about what is right for the greater good. It's like Spock, you know, we think about the greater good, you know, for the goodness of all, and what will impact everyone that way. I have a bunch of exercises I use to teach children and prisoners and delinquents who maybe have skewed cultural references for ethical moral compasses. That's kind of interesting. So let me see what we have. How do we define all? What do you mean by all?
What's best for everyone? Is that Mark?
Well,
Yes, for the greater good, and that's one of the questions, because all could be my group and not your group.
There you go.
Yeah,
And I agree, and that's why I asked the question, and that's why I think the moral compass is culturally or contextually determined. So this is my stock example. Japanese kamikaze pilots thought they were sacrificing themselves for the greater good, for the good of all as they defined it. Nobody asked me, but I don't think that was a particularly good idea. So that means that my moral compass is different from theirs because it's a culturally different context.
Yes, and then there's also the culture of war, which changes things all over the place, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is not to say that that the cultural consensus that I think constitutes morality can't be examined ethically. I think it should be. Rabbi,
what do you think on that?
This gets into the weeds.
It does get into the weeds. It's a good one.
It's extremely, and I've come up with a formulation that's mine, because when you look at the difference, I wonder what's the difference between morality and ethics. And etymologically, there is no difference. They both derive from the same Greek root. One comes through the Latin and one doesn't. But I wanted to propose a distinction because in English we use the term moralizing, which means that I am speaking in the voice of a higher authority. The problem is we don't all recognize the same higher authority. So what's moral to me because of what my God says may be different to you because of what you believe your God says. And there's no way we're ever going to reconcile that. So this is where I think ethics comes in. Ethics is a way of sort of a grassroots approach to identifying common values, universal values that we can all agree on. And for the most part, we agree on don't murder, we agree on don't steal. But there's a lot of gray areas that we have to grapple with. And that's why we have to have these ethical discussions. So in the context, let's take Mark's example, in the context of the kamikaze pilots, what about sending a Navy SEAL on a suicide mission? He's going to risk his life, or his group are going to risk their lives to accomplish a mission that is going to ultimately serve the cause, serve the nation, serve the war effort in a way that will save lives. Let's talk about something like dropping the atom bomb on Hiroshima. Still debated. Many believe that by doing so, many lives were saved on both sides. And there was also a lack of understanding about would it even work? What would happen? I recently heard evidence that they actually warned the people to get out of the city before they dropped it. We're not going to come to easy, clear, definitive answers on these kinds of questions. What we do is that we try to see the whole picture, and then we try to weigh priorities. sometimes putting the welfare of the many ahead of the individual is entirely defensible. And sometimes you can't sacrifice the individual because the individual really represents every other individual that's part of the collective. So in having these discussions, we're not going to come to clear answers. What we can try to do is understand the questions better. And by doing so, improve our perspective and our sensitivity.
And we can learn how to talk about things and to listen respectfully to someone with whom we disagree vehemently. I think it's important. A lot of us, I think, get our feelings hurt. So we talk about misbehavior. One of the biggest forms of misbehavior comes from the golden rule, I think. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, that's a very self-oriented thing. It should be the platinum rule, do unto others as they would prefer, correct? Mm-hmm. I was always confused by that as a child. In fact, I got sent to the principal's office for asking about it in Sunday school when I was in second grade. I'll never forget that. That was one mean nun, okay? But most of them were nice. I'm just defending. Okay. So the whole issue of what is it you want? That's complicated. How do we know what other people want without discussion? If we're looking at their reactions, well, some people have a big reaction, so we know their reactions. Some people have automatic reactions, and it's not really how they feel. Some people have no reactions. We have no clue how they feel, unless their heart is tied up to a monitor so we can feel, see the beats. So how do you know when you're offending someone or when someone needs some sort of ethical sensitivity from you in that moment? And that is one of the questions that causes conflict. When we're too in our own heads and are thoughtless of the context. So I think mindfulness, let's talk about mindfulness. It requires awareness of ourselves, of others, and the various contexts in which we find ourselves. That's not easy to do. It takes a lot of effort. But as the Rabbi and I were talking about another time ago, we have to stretch our ethical muscles and get our ethical vocabulary, ethical strategies. If we do some of this thinking ahead of time, like Richard was talking about the last time, then you come to any situation with a template of what might be a good possibility for responding. And even that kind of thinking helps our amygdala click off. Our amygdala is automatic when we're angry. But the minute we have a thought and a template helps us mitigate that automatic response, right? So some of us have fight, flight, or fear. We freeze with fear, right? If we have an automatic template as a starting point for how to handle conflict, already our amygdala is in trouble. It's not going to be able to do its job all the way because it invites our brain to the party. So let's get back to the issue of then, if we're not going to solve the issue of morality and ethics, where do we start with the issue of conflict? Rabbi?
I think that we want to try and see conflict not as an evil. There's actually a concept in Jewish thought that we shouldn't talk about good and bad character traits, because every character trait has a time that when it's appropriate. There's a time for anger. There's a time for hatred. There's a time for violence, not a character trait exactly, but, and there are times when what we consider positive traits are inappropriate. There are times when kindness is not appropriate. If I see I'm passing by a liquor store and some fellow smelling of whiskey comes up and says, "Can you give me $10 for some food?" It would be an act of kindness to give him $10, but it really wouldn't be in his own best interest. So we think of conflict as negative. What we really should think of conflict as is a tool like any other psychological phenomenon. And the idea, this term constructive disagreement, conflict where, I talked about this in my TED Talk, the two great academies of Jewish study 2,000 years ago, that history records that when they argued in the study hall, that they fought as if with swords and spears. But when they left the study hall, they were good friends. because they always made the effort to understand one another. And in fact, the opinion that we follow, the House of Hillel, why do we follow the House of Hillel? Because not only do they cite the other opinion with theirs, but they cite the other opinion before theirs. Because only when you understand the other side of an issue can you fully understand your own. Only when you grapple and hash out your differences can you start to see the bigger picture that allows you to get close to the truth. So seeing conflict as an opportunity will help us get past that initial fear of conflict that prevents us from having the difficult conversations.
I could listen to you forever. One of the things that Joanna just asked is, what if the other person wants is unethical or against your beliefs? And I think that speaks to what the rabbi was just talking about. My twin sister has found a solution to that time-old problem. She lives in Miami, and she's an Episcopalian Catholic light. So different. And she makes sandwiches for people and gives them. She makes peanut butter sandwiches, and as long as they're not allergic to peanuts, we're good. And she gives people sandwiches and a juice box rather than give them money, because then they cannot go and buy the alcohol. I guess they can always trade, but if they're working that hard, then they should be entrepreneurs, and maybe they'll find a way to support themselves, right? So the issue is kindness in the moment is sometimes complicated. I think let's talk about conflict now for a second, the other part of that question. Conflict to me and anger are the gift that keep on giving. If you take anger and you swallow it, it becomes depression. That's one of the Menninger brothers talked about. And then it breeds rage, suicide, repression, passive aggressive behavior. I do not believe we need more passive aggressive people in the world, do we? I don't think so. Not my favorite. Or aggressive people. I think what we need is people who are aware that anger is a gift. It invites you to pay attention. And you have to ask yourself first. So if you're on top of the world, and let's say you're Yoda, okay? And he is, let's say he's got the best moral compass in the world. He asks himself two questions. Why is this person angry with me? Or why is this person angry? Maybe it's not with me. And then he tries to answer the question. Now, as a psychologist, I know that one of the most unwise things we can do is ask an angry person directly. The nurses at Johns Hopkins Shock Trauma Unit came up with a device called the drink of water test. So let's pretend I have this full cup that doesn't have a sippy lid. And let's say Dave Bricker and I, Dave's one of my dear friends. Let's say he and I are having a fight. All right. And let's say I cannot drink this without spilling, choking, gagging, or throwing at him. And maybe he can't either, or maybe just one of us can, right? We shouldn't be talking verbally at that moment. That's time for a break. So the nurses at Shock Trauma knew that if someone is too angry to be rational, to be able to talk and listen, the way to tell it before anyone gets bruised or a bedpan gets thrown is to see, do they pass the drink of water? Get them water, get them tea, get them juice, get them whatever. Now, caffeine in that moment may not be the right thing, but there's herbal tea. So then and certainly not an alcoholic drink. That doesn't generally help anyone behave better. One of the things then we think about is then, why me? How did I contribute to this? Now, if you're Catholic, you say, oy, me culpa, I brought this on myself. I'm teasing a little bit. But the question is, how did I contribute to this conflict, if at all? Maybe I contributed because I'm a Cuban grandma and they don't like Cuban grandmas because we did kind of take over Miami. I'm sorry, okay? You need a passport now to get to Miami, all right? We did take over. So maybe it's something I said or didn't say or did or didn't do, who knows? So we have to ask those questions. Why is this person angry? And if we can ask that with empathy, and empathy is that horrible thing that requires you to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It's not convenient compassion where you say, bummer, and express some words. It's real empathy, trying to understand, how are they feeling? Why are they feeling this? That's a really hard question to address to ourselves, because right in that moment we may feel victimized or scared. If we can ask those two questions during anger, then anger can be a gift. It can be that opportunity that the good rabbi was talking about. Anger can be a destructive source if we feed it. A lot of people collect grudges and injuries. We all know them, and we all have. Think for a hot second in your own mind something you feel a grudge about. Just you're having trouble forgiving. It didn't take long. Maybe it's the remnants of something because you're very sophisticated, but we all have them. And the point is, what do you want to do with it? So we're going to be talking about forgiveness and apologies and all of that. So Mark O'Brien says, should that person ask, why am I angry? Yes, they should. But the problem is if our amygdala is going off, we're not thinking, why am I angry at all? We're thinking, you made me late. You made me mad. You made me lose your temper. Often anger is the language of blame, right? We often don't say, I'm angry at myself because I didn't leave on time. And so this grandma driving the speed limit didn't really make me late. People are not always gracious when they're very angry. Dave Bricker just said, never criticize a man till you've walked a mile in his shoes. That way you'll be a mile away from him and you'll have his shoes. Thank you, Dave Bricker. We can always count on his sense of humor. Let's see if we have anything else. Rabbi, what do you have to say about all this stuff we've been talking about?
Well, the sages compare anger to idolatry.
Oh.
Because you think about what you're feeling when you're really angry. There's very little rational processing going on. You are absolutely focused. This anger is all that exists in your world. It's everything. And so the sages also say, don't try to appease a person in the time of his anger. As what you were saying before, timing is important. And again, that's another ethical issue. If you see that doing the right thing is actually going to make things worse, that's a cue that it's not the right thing now. Sure, you want to appease a person. But if you've ever been in that situation, I know I have, where you're ferociously arguing a point, and in the midst of the argument, it suddenly dawns on you that you're wrong. Ever have that experience? What do most of us do right then? We double down. Now I really have to win this argument. Now think about how irrational that is. I'm arguing for something that I've just realized is not correct, is not proper, because I'm so emotionally invested in it that I don't even care about the truth anymore. And if we have the maturity, right, to do what Mark suggests, which is to laugh, laugh at ourselves. You know, that's the difference between sarcasm and irony. Sarcasm is when it's directed at another person, and irony is when it's directed at all of us together. When we can laugh at ourselves, then we can really defuse the issue. But the problem is we have to get to the point where we have the intellectual integrity and the intellectual humility to be willing to do that in the moment. And that's asking a lot for all of us. You know, you mentioned the golden rule, and in a Jewish tradition, it comes down to us from the sage Hillel, who said, don't do to others what is hateful in your eyes. He put it in the reverse. And it has everything to do with empathy. It doesn't mean that, well, I wouldn't mind if you play your drums at 3 a.m. next door to me, so it's okay if I do. That's not what Hillel meant. He meant try to put yourself in the other person's position and consider how your actions might be perceived, might be taken. And then he went on to say that, because he was asked to teach the entirety of the Torah on one foot, he said, what's hateful to you, don't do to another, and the rest is commentary. Go learn it. The more we study ethical ideas, the more we study ancient wisdom, the more we study the principles of being a good person, the more equipped we are to understand and respond properly to these types of situations when they arise in the moment.
Bravo. You have a question, Aya? You can put it in the chat or you can ask it.
No, I would like to say something. I don't have any question, but it's also very interesting for me and about the timing, values, and relativity, and also this moral, which is defined according to the values of the societies of the group or any other kind of values, and it defines also the culture. But on one hand, it is relative because all of these values, all of this timing are relative depending on the society or the group. But on the other hand, moral is something something as one. I mean, this is possible to unite all of these different values, to adjust, to interpret the languages, and to see, okay, there is some special situation with special values in a special time, with special understanding, and which are all relative, but somewhere else there are some other things, and how we can adjust these things. It is an art. It is an art of expression. It is an art of interpretation. It's an art of communication in order to understand the different languages, the different metaphor that sometimes it is used to express something. And this is also very important, to be united at the end, to have the same moral, same understanding of the moral, and to know the situation in order to use the conflict to avoid them in the future. I think this is very important as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think that was lovely,
It was.
and I think it really speaks to the challenge that we have today in our society, where we're becoming increasingly polarized, largely because we don't share the same moral axioms anymore. You know, when this country was founded, it was based on the idea that individuals are free to live their own lives as part of a society. And that means that there has to be a give and take. And it presupposes that we all have the same moral axioms that define our outlook on life, even if we may have different styles and different ways of applying those principles. But what you see today is that we've become so far apart, so divided in the principles that guide our lives, that, you know, it really seems if there were some practical way to divide the country and have all the urban people who tend to be liberal in one place and all the more rural people who tend to be conservative in the other. But there's no practical way to do that. We have to figure out how to live together. Because if we don't, then we're really facing chaos and not the path we want to go down.
That is for sure. And in the meantime, when we get down to the day-to-day, the question is, how will we manage individuals in our path? Who do we invite into that path? Who comes in uninvited? How do we handle them? Joanna asked a relevant question: what's the difference between anger and aggression? Questions like that, asking them even before we address the issue, that's what it takes, I think, to improve our ethical muscles, right? We asked that question. Rabbi, you want to take that one? Or is it
I thought that was a question for the shrink, but
I'll answer it afterwards, but I always love your take on things.
Anger is an emotion and aggression is a behavior. I think it's the simple way of looking at it. So certainly aggression can be motivated by anger, although I think some aggressive people are aggressive by their temperament, by their personality. You know, if you're playing professional football aggression is probably something that's going to come in fairly handy. If you're working for the diplomatic corps, aggression might not be an asset. So, again, it's one of these situational things. It's not that aggression is good or bad. It's knowing when to apply it and not allowing it to be anger directed. One of the pieces of advice that I picked up when I was trying to raise my children properly, and this was back before it was no longer acceptable to spank or to hit your children in a controlled way. But the idea was never give a potch, never give a slap when you're mad. So it's okay to act mad. When your 2-year-old runs into the street in front of traffic, you don't sit down and have a long conversation about why that's the wrong thing to do, because they don't have the capacity to understand. So you wag your finger and you put on your stern face and you use your stern tone of voice. I shouldn't be mad at the 2-year-old for rushing into traffic, because that's what 2-year-olds do. But I want to teach the 2-year-old not to do that, because I want them to be a 3-year-old. So I can act aggressive, I can act angry without being angry. If I get mad at my 2-year-old, that's really something that's a defect in me.
So one way of looking at aggression is behavioral aggression, and another is verbal aggression. Some people are never aggressive physically, but they eviscerate people with words. Aggression is an act that can't be missed. I mean, if someone's being aggressive to you, you get it. The problem with aggression is you can also have passive aggressive behavior, which is just as aggressive, but it's done in a way that makes you feel slimed. And if you don't know yourself well and are inclined to take too much credit or blame for things, you might actually think it's your fault, like in abuse situations. That's my fault that I'd only said the right thing. If I'd done the dishes on time, if I had pleased my wife more, I wouldn't have gotten hit or whatever. So the issue with aggression is the choices we make with respond to our anger or someone else's anger. So if I'm passive aggressive, I'm harming people and I'm harming myself equally, but in such a sneaky way that sometimes it's missed. In the corporate world, the people that can ruin a corporate culture or even a sports team are the passive aggressive ones, because people go shaking their heads. The ones that go over the line aggressively, we reward them and pay them more money depending on the sport. We put them in penalty and then we root for them, or we fire them depending on the sport. In ice skating, aggression is not good. Breaking someone's kneecap, not good. Breaking someone's kneecap in hockey, if you break a tooth too, good. I mean, so it depends on the sport and the cultural thing there. Yes, Dave Bricker.
Just posted a link which represents perhaps an interesting middle ground in this discussion. You can check it after the session. But Steve Lukather, the guitar player from the band Toto, who's a fantastic electric guitarist, had an incident where his neighbors were using their leaf blowers at 7 o'clock in the morning, I think on a weekend. And so he hauled his amplifier out into the yard and gave them what was coming to them in terms of a loud, blistering guitar solo. Now, when we talk about aggressive, I mean, we talk in principle, he probably should have gone and politely knocked on their door. There are all sorts of right things to do, but I'm sorry, I find this really funny. These people got their comeuppance, and in a way that turned out to be very public. And sorry, I see Yonason smiling too. It's kind of a funny scenario. And so, yeah, there are these times where people are receptive, or you wait until they're receptive to, hey, can I make a comment on what you said last night or something like that? And then there are sometimes oblivious people. And if you can send a message in a nonviolent way, sometimes they're not going to hear you anyway. And maybe you get a little fun out of it. So there's a gray area I thought I would just pop into the conversation, because it's not as black and white perhaps as we might think.
Now, there's a story about Teddy Roosevelt told one of his political allies to go call on one of their political adversaries. And he said, and take a baseball bat with you. and hit him right between the eyes. He said, that's to get his attention.
And then let the diplomacy begin, right?
Sometimes, but you know, it's the problem with the story you told, which I think a lot of us feel sympathetic to the to the guitar player. The problem with that is that it's so easy to convince ourselves that that response is appropriate whenever we get our feathers ruffled, whereas it's pretty uncommon that that type of a response is actually going to be in order.
I agree with that. So Gerald asked a question: if a person is chronically defensive or angry and hard to approach, is there any way to soften and help them understand that they're not resolving the problem? And that's a good question. So the question is, how do you reach someone that you care about who is chronically defensive is a different question than how do you reach somebody who you work with or who you live near or who is a relative that you don't necessarily love. So that's a different answer. It depends on your closeness to them, correct? If you love someone, it is your moral and ethical imperative to truly find a way to understand what they're dealing with. And I always ask myself is, what are they really feeling and why are they so chronically angry? Someone had said earlier that, Mark, aggression may be an attempt to mask insecurity. A lot of times when we see, like in kids, it's easier to see things because they don't hide it as well as us grown-ups, alleged grown-ups. If a kid is scared, they look angry. This is stupid. I don't like it. Well, maybe they don't know how to read. So they act like the class clown or the bully. Maybe they're not really those things. They just don't want to be embarrassed. So we have to ask ourselves, what is motivating this chronic anger? And there are reasons for chronic anger. And it could be that they're scared. It could be they're not feeling well. It could be that they're immature. It could be that they're unwell emotionally. Some people are never happy because they were spoiled as kids. So it's never enough. There are some people in our lives that we cannot fix and will never be fixable. And the question is, how do we share love? Like, let's say you have a mother who is an alcoholic and gets mean and whatever. The question is always for us, what kind of person do I want to be with somebody who is that impaired? The answer isn't always as important as asking the question and continuing to ask the question. And what you can do. My philosophy is you never have to live. There's an expression, don't let the devil in the door. If someone is so aggressive that you can't control them, don't invite them to your house, meet them somewhere else. You have some authority and responsibility over your own domain, right? And protect it. And you don't have to tell them, Mom, I'm not inviting you because you're an alcoholic, da, da, da. I think telling people why you do things is a rookie mistake. If someone's not going to be able to have a conversation about how you feel about their behavior, that you're worried about them, and what can I do to help you, Mom? Do you understand why I'm worried? If you can't have a sympathetic discussion with someone, perhaps you should not. But you could show them with behavior, be loving, be kind, don't set the limits. A friend of mine is a lovely human being, but after one drink, she treats her husband terribly. I'm not going to watch that. I can't. So I just leave. If we're somewhere like usually there's like meetings where there's dinner and a drink or whatever. And after one drink, I leave. And after years of doing this, she finally came up to me and she said, you've been doing this for years. You don't like how I treat my husband. I said, bing, got it. So how'd you decide that? She said, I stopped drinking and I started to notice things differently. Well, I'm really happy for you. Let's drink on it. No, I didn't say that. So then the issue is, how do we respond to chronic anger? So there's no right answer. There are a lot of wrong ones. Rabbi?
Well, I like what comes out of that story, because what I was thinking as you were talking was that we have to recognize we can't fix everything. But the asterisk that goes with that is we can't fix everything now. Maybe by not taking the direct approach, we can actually pave the way, because eventually your friend did figure it out.
Yeah.
And your passive response, not passive aggressive, but your passive
My
response,
kind response. Yeah.
removing yourself from the situation, sent a subtle message that eventually she picked up on. So yeah, you couldn't solve the problem in the moment, but you contributed to the solution over the course of time.
Relationships are a long con, right?
Yeah.
A long game. You have to think, what is the outcome you want for yourself and for others?
Yeah,
And then you have
especially
to
with
plan
people
for that.
closest to.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
When I taught high school, I made a point of trying to, as often as possible, throw out provocative statements that would ruffle my.
No, you?
Yes. And typically they would respond in a typical teenage way that is not limited to teenagers. They would say, "That makes no sense." To which I would reply, "What you mean is you don't understand it." And at the beginning of the school year, we would go through periodic discussions. Well, it's the same thing. No, when you say it makes no sense, you've already issued a verdict. When you say I don't understand it, you've left open the possibility that maybe the problem's with me. And I was always gratified when we got to the point where if a student said, "That makes no sense," the rest of the students would yell, "You mean you don't understand it?" That was the victory. That was the change in mindset, to first look inside myself. How is this? What does this have to do with me? Am I responsible? Is there a lesson for me to learn? Do I have some of this inside myself? And what can I do? What's the appropriate response to acknowledge or deal with the situation in a way that's proportionate, in a way that's sensitive, in a way that's going to have some chance of being effective?
So let's suppose that the ethical imperative is for all of us to live our best lives so that we can contribute maximally to the joy in the world and to help the world be better. If we assume that, the next step in we're dealing with someone chronically, let's go back to that one because that's the hardest issue, I think. We're dealing with someone in our lives who's chronically angry and yucky, right? It's a technical term, yucky. I think the first step, I learned from Ann Landers, a great philosopher. She was dealing with a woman who wrote in, dear Abby, so it says her, dear Anne. And she says, "My husband is horrible. He doesn't appreciate me. He's nasty. He's this, he's this, he's this, he's this. I want to make him suffer." And she writes back, "Be the perfect wife, be the perfect mother, make yourself happy, create a great social life, make your house look beautiful, prepare great meals, and after a month, leave him, and then he'll suffer." So moral of the story is, in a month, she writes back, "We've never been happier." What a coincidence that taking responsibility for our own happiness and our own world can change the world. The solution isn't so simple because some people will never respond to us being happier, but then maybe it's more clear that this person needs help. Maybe they need medical help. Maybe they have a tumor. It's not a tumor. All right, maybe it is. Maybe they have a drinking problem. Maybe they just have a bad habit of being nasty. We don't know. Maybe they're constipated. We don't know. Why are they chronically angry? The question is then, what do you want to do about it? And the first step is, where do you set limits? Well, one of the limits we set is with our own personal power to sculpt our own lives. The other limit is, how do we set limits when someone's being yucky to us? We can walk away. We can say, "Hey, I don't like when you talk to me that way." Or, "In this house, we agreed to talk with kind words. Let's start over." Or, "How about if I get us a cup of tea and let's start over? I want to hear what's making you mad," right? And then you understand it. The word "making you mad" is even a conundrum. No one can make us mad, but some people are gifted. And so the issue is, maybe I'm angry because you've done something, but we use the phrase "making you mad," which helps us have blame. But with someone who is blamey, saying, "Let's see what makes you mad," catches their attention. We're speaking their language, even if it's not a good language. It's not a bad place to meet someone where they are, right? The police, I used to train police in handling violent people. And sometimes you have to meet them up here. If they're yelling, then you yell, and then you bring them down. They have a 3 yes technique. So the world stinks. Yes. It's all my fault. Yes. And you feel hopeless. Yes. And so you do it louder, and the 3 yeses, you calm them down. That's a police technique in many police departments. It works with loved ones. It works with colleagues. If someone's going to the point of not just being aggressive verbally, or maybe it's aggressive in a way that's abusive, I do not believe we serve anyone by allowing ourselves to be victims of abuse. Volunteering for it makes it a mental illness. Allowing it makes it a bad choice, right? Some people volunteer for it. That needs therapy. They're victims and they somehow think they deserve it. That's not something you can fix in a conversation. You need therapy. John Tenza asks, whose truth is right? Isn't there always some level of truth to both sides? Well, I'm always right. Right, Rabbi?
Of course.
Isn't it always me? So what do you say about that? This is our last, this is our swan song. We'll end on this and then one last bit of wisdom.
I could give a whole, I have given a whole lecture on this topic. If you look at a 3-dimensional object, let's say a book, right? So is this the book? Is this the book? Is this the book? Is this the book? Or is that the book? Well, of course, every one of those angles is and is not. You can't see a 3-dimensional object. You can't see all of it at the same time. So when you talk about this phrase, which is really insidious, of relative truth, it's not so much a question of relative truth, but a question of incomplete truth. The sages say that Jews argue more than non-Jews and scholars argue more than non-scholars. Because when you have a culture that's focused on scholarship, the more you learn, the more clearly you develop a view of the truth. But your view of the truth is going to be limited because you can only look from one angle at a time. And so you become more passionate about your perspective on the truth, and you fight harder for that because you see it clearer and you're more committed to it. But at the same time, so is the other person who's looking from a different point of view, who's seeing a different angle on the truth. And it is that willingness to try to put yourself in someone else's position. This is where we come back to empathy, to try and see it from another side, from another angle, to understand, why does this person see it differently from the way I do? Try to understand that. And once I do, then suddenly I'll discover that there really is not as much reason for conflict and anger and contention as I thought there was when I was convinced that my way is the only way of looking at it.
All right, and then Adam asks a question or makes a comment that is very good. We speak a lot about morally and how we treat others morally. Do we have a moral obligation to ourselves? The answer is yes. And the give an example about your friend mistreating her husband and how you had to leave a situation, is that punishing yourself? I think our first responsibility is to God and ourselves. I think it flows from there. Even people who don't believe in God, then we can say to you first, and you have to first treat yourself well and know what you will and will not put up with and how you will contribute to the greater good. A lot of people are just take. I think morality is about give and take. In terms of setting limits with others, if someone is misbehaving, is it more punishing to stay there and expect them to change than to leave a situation that you know can't be changed? If once or twice you ask someone to please not have the second drink, let's all just have one drink. And, certainly I tried that over the years. Let's have one drink and enjoy, because some of us have more trouble with alcohol than others. There's all sorts of ways to say it, but let's all just have one drink, and then we can have a nice meal, and then we'll go to the movies. The minute, though, some people have one drink, they no longer have any self-control. Some people are allergic to alcohol, and they have a hard time stopping. They can learn to stop, but then they can't drink at all. Some people can learn to drink ritually, but it still then triggers the impulse to drink more. And some people have accomplished amazing things with drugs and alcohol, whatever. But my point is, I cannot allow my social safeness to be dictated by someone who's not in full control of theirs. So is it punishing? Yeah, I guess in a way it's punishing for me to leave a social situation, but I think it's more punishing to stay. And I'm also setting the tone that if you want me in your group, let's be nice, okay? If we're not nice, I'm not going to stay. People who are trashing, people who are gossiping, I just say, okay, guys, bye. And I go. And I don't say it passive aggressively. I just say, I don't like to listen to that. Nor do I want to be that person that says, hi, guys, Sister Mary Margarita says no gossiping at the table. And I think gossiping is evil. I don't like it. Talking about people when they're not there is uncomfortable. Even sometimes bragging about people behind their back, if it goes on and on, feels uncomfortable. So what is the most respectful thing to do? That's what makes me feel unpunished if I'm in the flow. So the one thing we didn't address is the issue of an apology. And I'll tell you my quick version of an apology. And I know, Rabbi, you have a longer version of an apology, but when dealing with kids for all these years, I came up with So, because when kids want to apologize, I used to make my kids 1, 2, 3, sorry. Well, it's just the word and the sorry. It's so aggressive. It's not really an apology, but it's a starting place, right? Or you have them go back to back and go 1, 2, 3, and you turn around, sorry. By then they're giggling. Or as my mother have an identical twin sister. When we'd fight, she'd have us on one side of a window or a glass door and the other one on the other, and we'd be doing this, cleaning it together. Or she'd make us put our foreheads together until we could laugh or say we're sorry. That's funny. The issue is an apology is very important. It's about empathy. It's about self-discipline. So with kids, I came up with the first is first you name the thing. That's the N. You say what it is that you did and its impact. I'm really sorry that I yelled at you. I know it hurt your feelings and I scared you or whatever. So you have to say the whole thing about, not like sorry, or my favorite is in the movies to say, I owe you an apology. And then they never apologize. Like in Dirty Dancing, sorry, Rabbi, it's one of my favorites. So the issue is, they say, I owe you an apology, but it never comes. And my bad. I don't think that's an apology. Maybe I'm just too old, but that's not an apology. Then you have to make a promise. So N, name it. M, make a promise to work hard not to do it again. I don't think you should promise to not do it because we're human beings. We can promise certain things, other things we can. I think we have to be careful with our promises. And then so it's N, M, and the third is M. Make up for it somehow. Some penance, a mitzvah, something to make up for it. So with kids, when they yell and scream, maybe they sing a song that's pretty. Maybe they slam the door and instead they do something nice, like they clean the dirty parts around the door or whatever. There's a wax on, wax off. The Japanese had morito therapy. When people are depressed, they have them do something of value to the greater good. They clean, they shop, they cook, they do things they garden, they weed. Have them do something as they can become the comeback king and queen. Some sort of do-over where they can have a chance to have some positive impact on the world. Okay, Rabbi, that's my 3-point shorty on apologies. I know you have a 16, or is it 600? How many commandments were there?
613. But
613. Okay, tell me about your long apology.
Well, it's really not so different from yours, and I'll just say it very briefly. The 4 steps in Jewish tradition are to stop the behavior, is 1. 2 is to feel remorse. If I don't think I did anything wrong, then the apology is meaningless. 3rd is to articulate the apology. Sometimes we call it a confession, where we actually verbalize, say it out loud. If it's against a person, to the person. If it's against God, it's to God. And then fourth is to have a strategy for how we're not going to repeat the same kind of behavior, because otherwise we'll just get back into our routine and we'll end up in the same place all over again. And then there really is a fifth element, which you also alluded to, which is to repair the damage. So if I was playing baseball and I hit the ball through your window, so I'm going to stop playing in that yard. I feel terrible that I broke your window. I come to you and I confess that I broke your window. And then I have a strategy. I'm going to go play in somebody else's yard next time, so I won't break your window. We're not good yet. I still have to pay for the window. The problem is that when we cause interpersonal harm, it's not always so easy to see how to make that up. And that's where some of the suggestions that you offered on creative ways to actually do something concrete to actually change the behavior in a way that demonstrates true remorse.
Like, that's how I became a gardener. I picked an orchid from my neighbor's yard when I was 7. I knew it was wrong, but I wanted it for my mother for Mother's Day. And my mother knew where I had gotten it. We lived near the botany department at the University of Miami, so she thought it might have been from there, but she knew it was from someone's garden. But it was for Grandpa Griffin, my first American grandpa, when we came to this country. And he was quite a gardener. And I went to him and I apologized. She said, "What's the right thing to do?" My parents were very obnoxious. They wouldn't tell me what to do. They had me come up with a plan. And that was just, at that time, I thought so unfair. Now I see how wise it was. And I said, "Well, I'm going to talk to Grandpa Griffin and I'm going to apologize. I'm going to give back the orchid. And then I'm going to offer to help him weed his garden." So he wouldn't accept the orchid back because he wanted it to be gifted to my mom, because she said my mom, in fact, he gave my mother 3 more orchids, but in the pots, because he thought she deserved them. Because there were 4 Guri children. I think he was apologizing to her for the 4 of us. I mean, each of us, an orchid for each one. And then I gardened for the rest of my time with him. So whenever I was outside and had some free time, I'd go over and weed. And he taught me all about plants. So that's how I became an accidental gardener, by stealing an orchid. So at its best. And Michael had the solution all along. Sometimes it's important not just to apologize, but to be accountable for your actions and willing to make the change. He hit the nail on the head with that one. All right, Rabbi, do we have some final words of wisdom?
That when you say you're going to have an hour-long program, you try to stay within your time.
Oh, and we have almost done that. We're 8 minutes over. So let's end with an apology. 2 apologies. One is, I'm sorry there was some confusion over the link. There was a problem with it, so I changed it. It's always going to be drredshoe.com/ethics. That way the URL can change, but the link is always the same. So keep that in mind, okay? I just use a pretty link, a pretty URL to make it easier to change it. And the second apology is sorry for being 8.5 minutes late now. So we'll try and be on time.